NYU who makes the comparison with melanoma. And I thought, well, that's a novel one. And all of a sudden it makes it very real, because that's something, hopefully we don't suffer with, but we all certainly worry about, every time we go out to the beach or to, spend some time in the sun, we're worrying about it. Or anytime we see something on our skin that looks off, right? All right. So does anybody want to read that first section? Let me make it a little bigger.
Okay, I'll go for it.
Thank you. Let's see. Is that big enough?
Yes. Scholars have long recognized that the King James translation of Sara'at as leprosy, Hansen's disease, which derives from the 70s Greek term lepra, meaning scaly or rough skin, is implausible. Leprosy is generally a scarring illness that leaves the victim permanently disfigured. The symptoms of Hansen's disease differ radically from those of Sara'at. This contrasts sharply with the picture drawn in the Parsha, in which a person with Sara'at could achieve a complete remission and re-enter the camp with any residual evidence of the antecedent skin condition. I'm just taking that in. The global epidemiology of Hansen's disease suggests that its incidence in most of the Middle East is close to zero. Thus, ancient Israelites would not have encountered it. This is especially true since recent studies suggest that leprosy was only introduced to the Middle East within the last 2,000 years.
Yeah, interestingly, I didn't even know that this was a thing in the United States. And a couple of years ago, I met a physician who specialized in leprosy, in what they're calling Hansen's disease.
Rabbi, there was a treatment center for leprosy actually at Bailey Seton Hospital.
At St. Vincent's?
Bailey Seton at St. Vincent. When Bailey Seton, when it was the public health hospital.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And this guy was in charge of the one at Bellevue. So clearly, multiple hospitals had it. I was assuming it was just Bellevue, but there you go. So I don't know why we don't hear about it more. It's very interesting.
It's very uncommon. I'm be in the car from after this. It's very uncommon. I think there's one place left either in Hawaii or Louisiana where they have one center. It's related to tuberculosis, only less contagious. It's real, and there's some treatment, but minimal. I mean, not minimal, but it's not really contagious like sneezing on somebody. So it's a slow-going process.
Got it. Thank you.
Just a quickie, if you ever see the film Braveheart, the guy's father supposedly has leprosy. If you ever watch a scene where the old king is like hiding out with a cloth over his mouth, that's what he was supposed to have had. But anyway, I'm saying goodbye. I'll be on, but not talking anymore.
All right. But just so you know, I don't know if you can see it. What we're talking about here is seeing if it lines up with melanoma. So, Jack, if you have any insight and you're able, and you are in a position to talk, we'd love to hear you. I know you're not a cancer doctor, but
I'm driving.
All right. We'll give you a break.
I'm a dentist doctor. Right. I'm
right.
fine. Okay. Thank you.
Fair enough.
Okay.
All right. Does somebody want to take this section?
It's Sharon, I can.
Thank you.
I suggest that the symptoms of biblical Sara'at fit melanoma, a serious form of skin cancer. This is based on 3 key features. In a warm climate with a high degree of exposure to sunlight, melanoma should have been fairly common. The high ambient sun exposure in this region would have put Israelites at substantial risk of skin cancer. Number 2, melanoma is a very serious condition with a high mortality rate. which would have provoked dread. It is likely that anyone who thought he or she was afflicted would have sought medical help and followed through with any therapeutic plan. As Siddhartha Mukherjee
do your best.
Yeah,
He's Indian.
that was my best, actually. Demonstrates in the emperor of all maladies, the ancients were familiar with cancer and recognized its lethality. Can you move it up? Thank you. Melanoma can be treated, and current immunotherapy can achieve a complete remission in patients with metastatic disease without surgical intervention and thus no permanent physical scar. Although a favorable outcome for patients with melanoma using treatments available 3 millennia ago was probably rare, the verses that describe the purification of the Metzora, the one afflicted with Zaraat, take for granted the possibility of complete remission without any residual damage.
Somebody want to take the next one?
I'll do it, Shelley.
Shelley.
Diagnosing melanoma then and now. Medically, melanoma is often described by the acronym ABCDE. A is asymmetric skin lesion. B, border of the lesion is irregular. C, multiple colors are a common aspect of melanoma. D, lesions larger than 6 millimeters in diameter are more likely to be melanoma. E, melanomas enlarge or evolve in appearance over time and can be elevated. While one is hard-pressed to make complete sense in medical terms of the description of Sarat, as it is presented in the text of Leviticus, many of these characteristics feature prominently in the description of the skin problem in Leviticus 13, a condition that warranted intense scrutiny. I need it moved up a little bit.
All right. So let's just jump over to Leviticus 13 and see it, and then we'll come back. All right, is that big enough?
Yep.
All right, you want to continue, Sean?
Yeah, but I only see 3. Is that
3 what? 3 verses?
The priest is this it? The priest shall examine the affliction on the skin of his body. If hair and the
but it should start earlier. It should start at 1. You're not seeing 1?
I got it. I'm seeing it.
Okay.
The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling, a rash, or a discoloration, and it develops into a scaly affection on the skin of his body, it shall be reported.
I suspect that might be a typo and should be affliction.
Affliction, I think so.
Yeah.
On the skin of his body, it shall be reported to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons, the priests. The priest shall examine the affliction on the skin of his body. If hair in the affected patch has turned white, and the affliction appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a leprous affliction. When the priest sees it, he shall pronounce him unclean. But if it is a white discoloration of his skin, which does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair on it has not turned white, the priest shall isolate him for another 7 days.
It shall isolate the affected person for 7 days. Yeah. 5.
On the 7th day, the priest shall examine him again. If the affliction has faded and has not spread on the skin, the priest
hold on. You jumped 1. Do 5. Although they're pretty similar.
Okay. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine him, and if the affliction has remained unchanged in color and the disease has not spread on the skin, the priest shall isolate him for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine him again. If the affliction has faded and has not spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is a rash. He shall wash his clothes, and he shall be clean. But if the rash should spread on the skin after he has presented himself to the priest and has been pronounced clean, he shall present himself again to the priest. And if the priest sees that the rash has spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy.
All right. Somebody else want to take over? Here, I'll do a little bit. 9. When a person has a scaly, again, affliction, I'm assuming here, it shall be reported to the priest. If the priest finds on the skin a white swelling, which has turned some hair white, with a patch of undiscolored flesh in the swelling, just so you know, it's hard to follow all of this. This is really technical, so if you're not holding all the details in your head at once, don't feel bad. I'm just reading it
at the end, right?
What's that?
There's no test at the end.
There's no test at the end, exactly. But I'm just reading it to kind of so we have a sense of what we're talking about. It is. I'll just start from 10 again. If the priest finds on the skin a white swelling which has turned some hair white with a patch of undiscolored flesh in the swelling, it is chronic leprosy on the skin of his body, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He need not isolate him, for he is unclean. All right, which seems to be confusing. If he's unclean, then you'd think you should isolate him. But the isolation that we're talking about here is in terms of holiness, in terms of going into the temple, in terms of partaking in the sacrifices and all of that. It doesn't seem like they were concerned about it being infectious to other people. It does seem like there was the possibility of it affecting, the home and the clothing and that sort of thing, but not as a communicable disease. All right, 12. If the eruption spread out over the skin so that it covers all the skin of the affected person from head to foot, wherever the priest can see. If the priest sees that the eruption has covered the whole body, he shall pronounce the affected person clean. He is clean, for he has turned all white. Right? This is also hard to understand. Right? We're saying that it's not clean, but if it takes over his whole body, all of a sudden he becomes clean. Right? All right, 14. Somebody else want to take a crack at it? Larry, you want to give it a go, or is it too small for you? You got to unmute. There you go.
You want me to read it?
If you can.
But as soon as undiscolored flesh appears in it, he shall be unclean.
Let's see, where are you? 15.
15.
When the priest sees.
When the priest sees the undiscolored flesh, he shall pronounce him unclean. The undiscolored flesh is unclean. It is leprosy. But if the undiscolored flesh again turns white, he shall come to the priest, and the priest shall examine him. If the affection has turned white, the priest shall pronounce the affected person clean. He is clean. When an inflammation appears on the skin of one's body and it heals, and a white swelling on a white discoloration streaked with red develops where the inflammation was, he shall present himself to the priest. If the priest finds that it appears lower than the rest of the skin, and that the
hair
and that the hair in it has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous affection that has broken out in the inflammation.
So I think you get the general drill here. that the coloring is clearly important. How far it spreads, if it's above the skin, right? And the argument that you're going to see, and Dan, if you can start presenting, I'm going to step away. Is I'll stop presenting. Is where am I? Yeah, it is quite similar to melanoma, and in a time when, so the big question becomes, so are we saying that the Torah didn't know what it was, and therefore it was presenting it as something that was spiritual and needed a spiritual malady? Well, that's a pretty serious argument, right? What are we saying? And especially if somebody believes that God is the author of the Torah, then that's a hard one to swallow. The implications of it is a whole interesting theological conversation in itself. But I just thought this perspective is worthwhile. So Dan, if you can present the other one, the Tzara'at as cancer, the other link. Perfect. And then go to diagnosing melanoma then and now. All right. No, go back up a little bit. Drop more. Stop. Perfect. All right. I'm going to step away for a couple of minutes because it's Sahava's birthday and a friend just dropped in. And I'm going to come back. Go ahead, guys.
I'll read. Diagnosing melanoma then and now. Medically, melanoma is often described by the acronym ABCDE. A, asymmetric skin lesion. B, border of the lesion is irregular. C, multiple colors are a common aspect of melanoma. D, lesions larger than 6 millimeters in diameter are more likely to be melanomas. E, melanomas enlarge or evolve in appearance over time or can be elevated. While one is hard-pressed to make complete sense in medical terms of the description of Tzara'at, as it is presented in the text of Leviticus, many of the characteristics feature prominently in the description of the skin problem in Leviticus 13, a condition that warranted intense scrutiny. 1. Asymmetric Tzara'at can assume the irregular shape of a swelling, scab, or bright spot. 2. Border B, the lesion could look like the scar of a burn, suggesting that the border was not smooth. 3. Colors C, Tzara'at is described as white or somewhat reddish. 4. Colored hairs. The hairs ranging in color from black to yellow to white is consistent with melanocytes being the cell of origin of the lesion. Melanocytes are derived from the stem cells that reside at the base of the hair follicle and produce the pigment that is incorporated into the skin and hair. Malignant transformation of melanocytes is the pathophysiological basis of melanoma. 5. Size. There is no size criterion in Chapter 13, so no correspondence on this account, but no contradiction either necessarily. 6. Elevated. E. Although the text does not describe elevated lesions, Sarat was not flush with the skin and initially was depressed, either deep or lower than the surface of the skin. 7. Evolve, E. Sarat could evolve over time and either spread or recede in intensity. The Kohen priest documented serial changes in the size, shape, inflammation, and hair color of the lesion and based his disposition of the Mitzorah based on these findings. If not, I don't mind reading. Do we have any discussion about it? Do people know someone who died of melanoma? Because I do, if you want to hear about it. So it was a cousin of mine, her husband had very light skin, and they lived near the beach, and he died of melanoma. And they went to the doctor, I guess, pointing out the change in shape and so on of his skin, and their suspicion that it might be a melanoma, but the doctors did a test and it came out negative, but it was actually positive. So they live near the beach, and I think the whole family is afraid to be out in the sun because of his death.
Can you tell me about when this was?
I'd say it's a long time ago. I'd say at least 30 years.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Why do you ask?
Well, because the diagnosis of melanoma has improved so much, it would be hard to believe that a laboratory would miss it.
Yeah.
This
it's hard to believe.
Currently, I mean, 30 years ago is another thing, but currently it would be hard to believe that a lab would miss it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll continue reading the quarantine. The need to quarantine the Mitzorah person suffering from Sarat during the evaluation period and banishment from the camp, if specific criteria were met, might justifiably be taken as evidence in support of an infectious cause for Sarat, a condition that was considered contagious. Melanoma, like all cancers, is not communicable and does not require isolation. Nevertheless, the need for quarantine may not be out of fear for bystanders contracting the illness. Not that the Kohen does not seem to be worried about himself when he examines the person's skin. Rather, it may be based on the perception that the sufferer was tame, impure, or how do you say that, Tom? And that
Tame.
And that his or her presence was therefore disruptive to the holiness of the camp. Yeah, I would think that that they not knowing that what kind of skin problem it is, they could be cautious because it could be contagious.
Exactly, and that's the big challenge with this whole subject. Are we talking about some other form of spiritual malady? Because Tuma and Tahara in general is a spiritual nature, right? The same water that can make something be susceptible to Tuma, to impurity, water can also purify, right? So it's not a biological, physical thing per se, at least in many of the ways it's described. but in other ways, it looks very much like a physical biological thing. And that's the push and pull that we all struggle with in trying to understand it.
So should I continue with the Cohen's treatment?
If you're willing, go for it.
I'm really curious to know how the Cohen would treat melanoma.
Right?
It is worth noting that under no circumstances does the Cohen excise the lesion. This is significant since surgery is not appropriate for patients with advanced metastatic disease. It is the standard of care for lower stage melanoma, but that is not what the Torah is describing. Instead, the Cohen matches the cancer and offers hope for remission in the future, which is consistent with current standard of care for patients with disseminating melanoma, namely modulation of the immune system. Stated differently, all conditions can have rare, spontaneous remissions. If the immune system is responsible for controlling melanoma and checkpoint inhibitor therapy potentiates the response, it is plausible, albeit rare, that melanoma could regress on its own, which is the best that could have been expected in ancient times. Caveat: ancient versus modern criteria, diagnostic criteria. A note of caution is warranted when reading modern medicine into Tzarat. Just as the Torah is not a historic text by modern standards, it would be anachronistic to apply current diagnostic categories in defining the nature of Tzarat. The ancients were excellent empirical scientists and accurately described many diseases such as diabetes, venereal disease, and gout. However, their theoretical framework and etiological explanations were worlds apart from our understanding of disease. The Cohen was not a subspecialist in oncology or infectious disease. Modern notions of contagiousness, infection, and cancer cannot be superimposed on theories of disease that were current in the ancient Near East. Nevertheless, I want to apply our ideas about disease to the Parsha and find meaning for us. Who is saying that, Rabbi?
What's that?
I came in late, so I don't know who's saying that I want to apply our ideas about disease to the Parsha.
I think it's the author. He's a physician. It gives his information at the end. So Hava wants the mouse. Okay, hold on. 1 second, kiddo. I know it's your birthday. Dr. Chaim Trachtman. So I guess his people were big thinkers. Chief of Pediatric Nephrology at NYU Langone. On the board of Yeshiva Maharat, which is the modern Orthodox, probably the closest to conservative Orthodox yeshiva there is, and is editor of Women and Men in Communal Prayer, Halachic Perspectives. So clearly he's a physician, but he's also learned in Torah.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Sure.
A lot of stuff from the Torah we learn from a word, a letter, why one letter is bigger and one letter is smaller. And here they're going on and on about, of all diseases, a skin disease. What do you think explains the Torah's emphasis on this particular skin disease?
So it's hard to know. I mean, and of course, like everything, it depends on what perspective we have of the Torah in general, right? So according to the regular traditional perspective, Sarat was seen as a punishment, for example, for Lashon Hara, for speaking badly, gossiping, character assassination, all of that of other people. And there's other ways that it's looked at metaphorically. And so it takes on a much bigger everyday meaning. From the documentary hypothesis, there's this idea that, there was a separate kind of version of the Torah, if you will, or parts of it that were written by Kohanim, who were obviously concerned about things that related to Kohanim, and this was a big part of their job. Assuming that this was prevalent, and according to the argument that he's making, that being in the Middle East and being in the sun all day without suntan lotion, he doesn't say that last part, but I doubt they had it. So that would explain, the big emphasis on it. So I think depending on one's perspective, but there aren't a lot of ways that a spiritual malady manifests in a physical thing, right? I mean, I think, as a psychologist, about what's the term? Psychosomatic or
convergent reactions or psychosomatic disease.
Right. This idea of when an emotional, psychological, mental, or whatever other word we use, condition actually affects the physical. But over here, it seems to be, in addition to that, also spiritual or religious. And you don't have that. I don't think anywhere else in the Torah. Does that answer the question, Ish?
Can I?
Yes. Thank you.
Sure.
Perspective.
Sure.
As a retired biology teacher.
I did not know that. That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that from my readings of health over the years, that lately we're understanding that vitamin D is a major supporter of the immune system.
Yep. That
it has many uses in the body besides the immune system. And maybe the people of the Middle East exposed to the sun, we look at the clothing that they wore, that they were trying to protect themselves from the sun. But maybe they were, because of having a lot of vitamin D, well, they say the people of our region of the earth have very little vitamin D, and so we have more illnesses. Maybe they have much fewer illnesses. And maybe the skin illnesses just stood out as something that they were wondering about and
worried about. Yeah.
And maybe that's why they have such great discussion about skin illnesses.
I mean, I know there's a lot of talk with vitamin D and COVID, right? In protecting, and I take it on a regular basis for that reason. I'm also because working from home a lot, but yeah.
But then there was another illness that was very common at that time was what do you call it? Leprosy.
So at the beginning, he was arguing that based on archaeology and all of that, that actually leprosy wasn't big in that part of the world. The leprosy that we know today, and there's actually, if you scroll back up down to that map, I don't know. I don't know how they did that study to come to that conclusion. There, you see it in Africa much more, and you see it in South America.
Is it a map of leprosy or melanoma?
I think they're talking about leprosy. If you look at the paragraph before, see what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, leprosy.
And then he's starting with melanoma after.
Uh-huh.
So I'm going to jump back to my guests, and I'm guessing there isn't too much left, right? Is that where we are? All right. Are you guys okay wrapping it up without me?
Sure.
All right.
Enjoy.
Sorry, next time you'll have my fully. All right, take care.
Happy birthday to Sahava. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Enjoy the birthday.
Thank you. Take care.
What do you want me to continue reading? Or
Sure, if you will, please.
okay. Implications of Tzara'at as cancer. What's the definition of Tzara'at again? Is it
That's a skin disease, the various manifestations.
A Torah perspective with a modern twist. We instinctively recognize that it is wrong to blame any affliction on a specific sin. Consider, for example, the revulsion we feel when people attribute the Holocaust to faulty mezuzot or assimilation. Our revulsion derives in part from the demystification of disease in modern society as a result of our ever improving scientific understanding of the pathogenesis of nearly all medical conditions. That being said, what might be the implications of viewing Tzara'at as an infection versus cancer, namely melanoma? The pathogenesis of infectious diseases versus cancer. Infectious diseases such as pneumonia, septic arthritis, and encephalitis are caused by discrete agents that are usually external to the person. They can be bacterial, as in S. pneumoniae, viral, West Nile, fungal, as in Candida, or protozoan, as in trypanosome. I know what each of those are, so if anyone has a question. There is an indefinable culprit for the clinical condition. In contrast, cancer is an internal biological process that arises from abnormal cell proliferation. In other words, something goes wrong with the way the cells divide. A very basis of life itself. Normal cell division for growth and adequate replacement of senescent cells is essential for body homeostasis. There are numerous overlapping systems in place to ensure proper balance between cell proliferation, growth, and death in all body organs, including cell cycle regulators and tumor suppressor genes. Cancer represents a breakdown in which proliferation becomes autonomous and unchecked. Cancer reflects a complex interaction between genetic susceptibility factors, environmental triggers, and disease modifiers. In truth, this applies to all disease. How should we apply this shift in the understanding of Tzara'at from infection to cancer? All of us myself included, are uncomfortable saying that a person got cancer or any illness because he or she committed such such and such sin. This is especially the case in circumstances where it is inconceivable that there can be fault, such as the diagnosis of leukemia in a toddler. Nevertheless, for many of us, our religious point of view makes it difficult to accept that what happens in the world is random or determined entirely by material forces. Two models of how to think about Tzara'at theologically. The classic viewed Tzara'at as an infectious leprosy, as a punishment for slander, Lashon Hara, fosters the worldview that a specific disease is punishment for a particular sin. Model 1. Outsiders may feel empowered to interpret the religious significance of other people's suffering. They may harshly interpret the illness as a punishment for the other moral failing. People who become sick may then be subject to public scrutiny and held responsible for their condition. They may become isolated because of social concerns about moral contagiousness or impurity. This only adds emotional pain to their physical suffering. Such a view of sin and punishment lacking any compassion was evident with great harm in the early years of the HIV epidemic. A different way of thinking about God's role comes from viewing Tzara'at as a form of cancer. Cancer is an illness tied to the way we are all internally wired to survive. Since it comes from internal issues, abnormal cell proliferation, instead of external sources such as contagious bacteria, it can inspire private introspection. Model 2. Rambam describes Tzara'at as an oat, the sign and wonder amongst Israel, Mishnah Torah, laws of leprosy, balancing the two biblical models. Model 1 is consistent with a non-priestly text like Miriam and Uzziah stories, which link Tzara'at to a specific transgression. In contrast, the priestly code in Leviticus, in which Tzara'at is viewed as part of the natural order that originates with God, is more consistent with Model 2. Human suffering, unfortunately, comes in many forms, including illness. As in much of Jewish thought, we encounter two conflicting worldviews about the origin of illness and suffering, and we are challenged to find a balance between them. Navigating safe passage between these two models may provide an approach to illness and suffering that enables a religious consciousness to embrace modern sensitivities.
Yeah, I don't get the second model at all. I mean, I understand that people feel uncomfortable about tracing the Holocaust to bad mezuzahs or skin cancer to Lashon Hara, but it seems like sort of a natural thing, a natural approach to the religious predisposition. I mean, God causes everything, so there must be a reason. I don't get the second model, but
yeah. Seems like that's why religious people in Williamsburg, for example, and Israel wouldn't want to get a vaccination because they believe that that God controls it. They didn't learn about viruses.
Yeah,
they don't know nothing of it.
You could also ask where the vaccination came from, if not from God. But that's
Right.
yeah. But anyway, we could go on forever.
Yeah. But it's interesting that the Bible has such interesting views, such a great description of melanoma.
Mm-hmm. And the thing about it is, it's a visible disease. It's not like belly cancer. It's a visible disease, so people more easily react to it, I guess. So thank you very much for reading, Larry.
Sure, no problem.
Yes, thank you for reading. Thank you for leading, Dan.
Thank you.
Taking over. No problem. All righty. I'm going to
Okay,
sign
thank
off
you.
now.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Week.